Oh, I do like to be beside the seaside. I do like to be beside the sea. Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions. Or perhaps I should say, welcome to Insmouth, the quaint little seaside town that sprang forth from the imagination of H.P. Lovecraft nearly 100 years ago, and has haunted the dreams and writing of many a horror scribe ever since. The particular writer we will be featuring this episode, fallen under the spell of this fishy locale, is Steve Rasnic Tem. Grab your beach brolly, swimming trunks, and inflatable unicorn life preserver. We're going where the sand meets the sea. In Steve Rasnic Tem's Between the Pilings. The dark blue neon scribble was so faint he had to stare a while to determine if it said vacancy or not. Finally, Whitcomb decided to take a chance. He went up to the battered screen door beneath the water-damaged sign. Between the Pilings, and in smaller letters, Insmouth Beach. And in even smaller letters, an afterthought, worn almost to illegibility. Accommodations. A light was on inside over a small counter, no brighter than a nightlight really, and he couldn't tell if the hunched shape beneath it was a person or the back of a chair. But the door was unlocked, so he went inside. He didn't see the clerk. Indeed, it was just a counter with a battered surface and the rounded top of a chair behind. He gazed around the shabby, antiqued room. The lichen green wallpaper appeared to be dotted with tiny pale flowers, but they were so faded they might have been random stains. The armchairs and the couch might have originally been of high quality, but were now so scraped and worn it was hard to believe a business could countenance their use. The rug sparkled, but he determined it was from the grains of sand worked into its fibers. There might have been a central pattern, but the design was thoroughly obscured in grime. Because of the numerous faded rectangles on the walls, he decided a number of pictures had been taken down. He had vague memories that it had been a fairly full gallery of past patrons displayed here. He didn't remember this room being so dilapidated, but he'd been barely 8 years old when last he'd been here, so how could he know? He'd had no standards. He'd been happy just to be alive, to swim and play and watch television, and to eat cake. Oh, how he'd loved his cakes. The strawberry ones his mother used to make, the slices delivered to him on sparkling white plates, with a kiss on the cheek. Room. The word was so low-pitched and faint it might have come from the floor. Whitcomb looked more closely at the counter, the door behind it, the bluish glow coming from somewhere below the counter's edge. Had someone just come through the door? But he still didn't see them. He moved closer, peering over the edge. He didn't believe in staring at people with disabilities. People all had differences, and we were all better off for it, in his opinion. But because he couldn't quite grasp the young man's malady, Whitcomb's gaze was fully engaged in staring. The body on the wide chair was relatively short, fat and lopsided, and, he thought, collapsed, as if the spine or a portion of the spine had been removed, allowing the rest of the young man to fall down in a clump because now there was too much flesh for the available height. The head was pushed forward by the swollen neck so that it was easier for the young man to look at the small computer screen in front of him than to look at Whitcomb above him. His two fleshy fingers flapped against the keys. His skin was pale and oily and poorly washed. Whitcomb thought of a giant frog that had once frightened him as a boy. "Yes, I would like to rent a room for 3 days, perhaps 4.
"That'll be 2 days in advance, then,"
the young man said, still without looking up.
$45 on the counter, please.
Whitcomb put his money down. The clerk used a pole with a hook on it to transfer keys from a pegboard to the counter, all without taking his eyes off the screen.
"Number 8, you been here before?"
"A long time ago. I was a child."
"Won't have changed much, except the beach is a tad closer. You have to leave your car parked up here on the street. Nobody'll bother it. Insmouth isn't like other places. There's some steps at the end of the building. You take those down under the boardwalk and out to the beach. The rooms are built around the timber pilings."
"I remember that part. It's unusual."
"That's why we have the name. Number 8 is near the middle, but you'll have to wait up here a bit while the maid sweeps it out."
"Sweeps it out?"
"We have a sand problem."
Whitcomb didn't remember a sand problem, nor was he clearly sure what that phrase meant, but children often didn't notice the things adults classified as disastrous. The opposite, Whitcomb thought, was also true. He looked for a place to sit. The couch looked like it might sink and fold itself around him, and the seats of all the chairs were thoroughly, darkly stained. He picked the least objectionable one, closed his eyes, and sat down. It made a squishing sound, as of rotting fruit. The room was silent for a time, except for the flap clicking of the keys on the other side of the counter, and the occasional sigh or struggle of breath from the clerk. Whitcomb could see out the dingy front window and down the street, spare of street lamps or even the usual illuminations leaked from windows or car headlights. Still, a bit of parchment glow made the shadows deeper and fuzzy-edged and sometimes runny, as darkness flowed from door to door, from one side of the street to the other. Feet and fingers and faces turned away. It was probably just him and his softly dying memories, but they might have been real. Had it been this way when he was a child? But everything was some bright adventure in a child's eyes, especially on vacation. His mother had hated it. He remembered that much, right up until the end. That summer, his mother had wanted to return to the southern seacoast where she'd been raised, to the extensive sands of Myrtle Beach, or at least Virginia Beach, so that their son could have a proper beach experience. But his father insisted that they had to stay in New England. They couldn't afford to travel farther than that. His father had won, as he did all arguments in which money was involved. At that point, Mother wanted nothing more to do with the planning. He hated those old men who babbled all the time, who had to fill up every silence with their voices, But there was so much to talk about, and no one to talk to. The billboards on the highway going in, I remember them as being so much brighter. That first one, Visit Historic Insmouth, with a collage of quaint Victorian buildings. You can barely make out the details now. The clerk said nothing. But even when Whitcomb had been a child and saw that billboard for the first time, the colours had seemed off, shaded into dirty greys. Far more bothersome had been the cartoon character who was supposedly speaking those words. Whitcomb had guessed it was meant to be a fish, but the eyes were wrong, the pupils appearing fixed and dilated. Perhaps he was editing it in the remembering, but he recalled them as the eyes of a dead human being. On this trip, that figure was missing completely, that side of the billboard scratched out. The second billboard, well, there's not much of an image left at all, is there? I remember this lovely picture of the Insmouth Pier with a wide shot of the ocean. Now everything is so heavily graffitied, loops and swirls and all kinds of nastiness emerging from the waves.
I've never been to the highway,
the clerk murmured.
I've never seen them.
Oh, sorry. Whitcomb thought perhaps he'd been rude to the young man, insensitive to his disability, whatever its specifics. He would not ask him then about the final billboard, now completely blank. Worse than blank, actually. Scoured down to grey, flaking wood. He couldn't imagine how the damage had occurred. Even a hurricane wouldn't have created such complete erasure. He tried to remember what it had looked like before, but he had never understood what it had been intended to depict. It had been in the process of being changed at the time, he thought. Newer strips pasted over older ones, or perhaps the newer bits torn off to reveal what lay underneath. The legs of a sunbathing beauty married to a beached sea lion or something similar, a chaos of torn and frayed buildings collapsing over them. He felt a cold draft and glanced at the front door. He saw no obvious gap at the bottom, but there was sand there, fingers of it flowing his way, as if blown. Suddenly the door banged open and a squat grey woman stood there holding the largest broom he had ever seen, the thick shaft of it filling her hand.
"The mister's room is ready,"
she proclaimed, and glared at him. He came quickly off the chair and squeezed past her, dashing to his car to retrieve a small suitcase. The trip down the stairs was long, and Whitcomb was glad not to have a steamer trunk to drag. It was also dark, and the railing minimal, so he took the steps slowly. In fact, it was so deeply in shadow in places that the only illumination was a sliver of moonlight reflected off the damp edges of scattered timbers. He remembered negotiating these steps as a child. Of course, it had been daylight and midsummer then. He remembered alternating areas of sunlight so bright it glazed the grey boards a brilliant white between shadows so dark he disappeared stepping into them. His mother behind him had been hysterical, sure he would kill himself flying down those rickety stairs. Now at the bottom, Whitcomb was confused. He remembered how it had been when he was 8, a broad strip of grass with a fountain and a bordering walk that shimmered from all the seashells embedded in the concrete, and beyond that the gleaming white beach. It would never look as good as it had on that first glimpse, and over the years he would wonder if his imagination had simply embellished it, because every day after that while they were there, it had appeared a bit grayer, a bit shabbier. Now there was no grass at all. He had stepped off into sand, and a few feet away were the piles of rubble, broken concrete, and other rubbish. And looking around him, he didn't see the rooms. Certainly the few closest to the staircase were gone, leaving only hollow, dark cavities filled with more sand. He started walking parallel to the pilings, peering into the darkness for some sign of the old motel, and finding none. It was hard to fathom how the young man up in that office at street level could believe he could get away with such a blatant con, taking money for rooms which no longer existed. But Whitcomb had his own eyes and the memory of what had once been here. He even ventured into the deeper shadows beneath the boardwalk, thinking the rooms might have been set back further into the seaside structure than he remembered. But the area was wiped clean. Then he passed one of the thicker pilings, and there was what was left of the old motel. A short stretch of rooms with battered screen doors and a single window each. He remembered the walls as a bright coral red, but these were a pale salmon color, repaired here and there with gray cement, like disease spots or patches of dead skin. A small light glowed above each door, along with a number. The first he saw was number 6. He paused in front of 8 before trying the key. He remembered following his father into the room all those years ago. He had no idea which number it had been. It hadn't been important to him, and they had all looked the same. There had been a bright, multicolored oval rug inside, some blonde furniture, and one large bed. He'd gazed at that bed in dismay until he'd seen the rollaway they'd rented just for him. He'd sat on that bed and bounced, declaring it perfect. His mother had come in slowly, her face drawn. She was rubbing her arms. "This sand, the wind blows it everywhere. It's burning my arms." "It's just ordinary sand, dear," Whitcomb's father had said. "You probably just have sunburn." "We've barely arrived. How could I?" "The drive-in, all those miles. You had your window rolled down, remember? And your arm resting on the frame. I told you should have put on sunblock when the trip began." "I'm wearing long sleeves," she'd said it crossly. She hadn't wanted to come here at all. "Lightweight fabric. You can practically see your arms through the cloth. It doesn't take much, a hot day like this." His father had never thought his mother intelligent. That was why he'd always been explaining things to her, trying to explain why she shouldn't feel upset, why she shouldn't be disappointed or angry. Everything was always fine, the way his father had explained things, even when Whitcomb didn't understand the explanations. Obviously his mother didn't understand them either, because as far as Whitcomb could remember, they had never helped. He'd resented that sometimes. She could have at least pretended to be happy. She could have been a good sport. Part of being happy, as he remembered from his childhood, was being able to pretend. Whitcomb felt strangely hesitant to enter number 8. He was afraid to be disappointed in what he found inside. Sand as white, as pure-looking as snow, had drifted out of the shadowland fronting the ocean and up to the concrete step in front of each door. It required only the dim light above each number to bring out the sand's unusual brilliance, its eerie luminescence. He looked down at his feet. Of course, he was standing in it. There was no grass or sidewalk anymore. From above, it looked oddly liquid, milk-like, rising and falling around his shoes. Nothing like sand at all. But he was tired, and he was drunk with memory. He fixed his eyes on the door and stepped forward. It was late, and the world was always a different place in the morning. The key made a scraping sound as it went into the keyhole. It felt like there might be debris inside. He turned the key, and tiny particles drifted out of the hole and down to the threshold, joining the fingers of sand that had already blown onto the recently swept step. He pushed the door open. It was dark and chilly in the room, as if instead of going inside, it actually gone out. He reached for a light switch and found it coated in grit, so was not optimistic about the maid's cleaning job. But when the lights came on, he was pleasantly surprised. The room brought back vividly the one from decades before. The furniture was the same or of a similar style, blonde wood with clean lines, typical of the 50s. There was even a rollaway, although the mattress was greyish, the frame spotted with rust. But the floor was clean, and the rug, although it wasn't the colourful one from years before. The colours were more muted, as were the colours throughout, he realised, shaded toward greying pastels. The blonde wood, duller, the ceiling white, less white, but there was a comfort in all that. After all, if it had been exactly the same, he might have been terrified. But that was all quite enough. Whitcomb thought he could not bear to be awake any longer. He dressed into his pajamas quickly, turned off the light, and slipped into bed. The sheets didn't feel crisp, but at least they weren't sandy. He didn't bother to set the alarm clock. He hadn't even noticed if there was one. He was content with awakening whenever. He had no idea how long he had slept when he first awakened. It was still dark out, according to his window, but he hadn't slept through the night in years, so that wasn't surprising. Wind scratched and occasionally beat on the door. He thought it might be raining because he could hear the spray against the glass. Surely the ocean was too far away for it to be the advanced spray of a wave. But he could not bring himself to check. Better not to know if he was about to drown. He leaned over the side of the bed to get a good view of the door. White had eased through the bottom, a few threads of it, sand, but perhaps he'd just tracked that in when he first came inside. His mother had complained of the sand, the way it burned, the whole time they had been here. Whitcomb hadn't understood. He loved it, couldn't get enough of it, the way it squeezed between the toes. It frightened him that she should have such a strong reaction. For years afterward, he would think of her when he met anyone with allergies or peculiar sensitivities. Some people lived in an unfriendly world. Certainly no one lived in his world, and he was uncomfortable whenever he ventured out of it. You're supposed to drive your life, not let your life drive you. Jane had shared that bit of insight the last time she'd consented to see him. Do something spontaneous for once. It was goodbye advice, but at least she had been sincere. She might have liked him more if he'd managed to be someone else. He might have pretended to her that his return visit to Insmouth was a spontaneous act, but of course it was not. It had been coming for years. He'd just been gathering his nerve. Over the years, he'd tried to remember every detail of that vacation when he'd been 8, and although he'd recreated much of it, a great many moments were still missing. It angered him, the way the bits wore off, and he could not decide if it was the mind's normal decay or the old realities themselves which were going away. Something about the process seemed deliberate, as if the universe didn't want him to remember anything. He did not feel sorry for himself. He'd made his choices. But he realized not everyone had a choice. Eventually all the bits of a life wore off, and for some even the memories went away. His father had gone on with his life, using drink to wipe the memory, but Whitcomb would remember his mother until the end. He must have dozed off, because when he opened his eyes again, the window was burning up with sun. He dressed himself in the sweats he'd bought for the occasion. He'd never owned a pair before. The door refused to open. He supposed the dampness had made it swell. He kept pulling until it came loose with a pop sound, a rain of grit pouring from the jam. He stepped out into an intense scouring of sky and sand, so much blue and white he had to close his eyes, opening them slowly again, using his hand as a shield. The beach looked ravaged, a churning of tiny white dunes and pitted places, black timbers and rocks showing ragged edges as if chewed. Streamers of rotting seaweed laced the beach, gulls landing to snatch tidbits, swiftly leaving as if the sand were too hot or corrosive to touch. Large amounts of fish flesh lay in partially digested chunks, the reek of it so foul his nose refused to process the smell. He gagged and turned to go back inside, but deciding he would not be so easily defeated, struck off down the line of pilings again, thinking he would see what remained here from his memories. There appeared to be no one else about, and given the unpleasant state of the shore here, he supposed that should come as no surprise. In bright daylight, he had a good look at what was left of the motel. 8 units, with the last 2 missing numbers and doors. He couldn't imagine who might rent such lodgings unless they were beyond desperate or ignorant, like himself. Perhaps they did all their renting after dark, when the extent of the damage could not be seen. He was curious if he had neighbors, but wouldn't go out of his way to meet them. The place hadn't been that busy when he'd been here before, when things were painted, in good repair, and at the height of summer. At best there had been 5 or 6 other family groupings, and a few isolated stragglers, tall figures in rain gear with large hats pulled down over their features, strolling the beach. And not all of the family members made use of the beach. Some, like his mother, made only rare forays past their motel doors or the grassy areas in front. But vacations weren't for everyone, or so he had heard. There were always some who felt safer, if not happier, at home. He gazed down the beach to where it narrowed, eventually disappearing into a tumble of stone. There was the main part of Insmouth, the old docks, the church towers, and the sprawling meeting halls. Several buildings near the edge had actually tumbled into the sea, leaving a slope of woody debris soaking up the ocean's salt and a splay of broken uprights. Surely he was mistaken, but he had a vague memory of the same ruins, the same collapse, present when he'd been here as a child. A broken chorus of voices rose with a sudden flight of black birds as if riding their backs into the air. The voices dissipated with the scattering paths of wings. Whitcomb had no desire to venture into that part of town, thinking it a far more dangerous place than this poor strip of sand. He caught sight of a familiar sign, and walking closer, caught himself in a tease of a smile. By the Sands Miniature Golf. His family had discovered the place their second day there, and even his mother had seemed to enjoy herself. It appeared to still be in business. He found himself passing through the gate without considering. At first he thought the fellow taking money was the motel clerk from the night before. They might have been twins. Then he saw that this one was a little taller, not as fat, and he hid one arm inside a voluminous sleeve. He handed the fellow $1 and was pointed to a rack of balls and clubs beside hole number 1. It was the usual layout of obstacles, ramps, windmills, passages through miniature buildings, and wide metal curves the ball could cling to for a left or right-hand turn. But there were local touches as well. A giant brass frog with a wide mouth. A ball entered the mouth and shot out the anus in some random direction. A water obstacle with leaping mechanical fish. Periodically, a fish would alter its trajectory by some mysterious means and snag the ball. An array of dilapidated buildings. He couldn't really tell if the destruction was cosmetic and faked or actual damage incurred by the miniature buildings because of exposure and lack of care. He didn't remember any specifics about this miniature golf course from his previous visits decades ago, but it seemed that some of these features might be new to him, except for the frog. Now that he thought about it, the brass frog had been here before. The last few holes had been invaded by sand, but that fit the golfing theme, did it not? Sand traps designed to defeat even the most professional of golfers. At hole 15, the sand trap moved, and the ball dissolved amidst a swirl of greedy, silvery grit, ending his game. As he left the golf course, he found himself staring at the ocean, the endless repeating waves, the long curving edges of foam, that meandering line where dark grey sea met an only slightly softer sky. As a boy, he'd thought that line dividing the air and water impossibly high, an instability that threatened everything he held dear. Now it seemed worse, and he thought he could detect structures inside it, only vaguely covered by the water, long reticulating lines, horizontal and vertical edges, the boxy shapes of some lost city, drowned beneath the waves. It made him feel empty, void of substance, and he realized he hadn't eaten and had gone to bed without dinner the night before. There had been a few small cafes, he remembered, accessible only from the beach, and he continued walking in the direction of that denser part of Insmouth, hoping one might still be in business. He closed his eyes at one point, having walked far longer than he had hoped and near to exhaustion. He did not remember finding the restaurant, or sitting down, or ordering, but the next thing he knew, he was blinking rapidly, and he was holding a large spoon, and warm and slippery things were washing down his throat. He almost choked when he realized it, and had to down a large glass of water, which tasted a bit too salty, and whose color was less than assuring. His teeth felt unstable, his tongue sore, the inside of his mouth scraped. He only vaguely remembered the meals he'd had when his parents brought him here as a child. He remembered feeling ravenous the whole time and devouring hot dogs and something else, some sort of pitta-like concoction from beach sign stands. His parents ate hardly anything at all. His father had been drinking, not as committedly as he would after that vacation, but enough that it made him quiet, grumpy, and without appetite. His mother, he was never sure if his mother ate anything during that trip. He vaguely remembered sitting with them in a small restaurant like this one, only cleaner, brighter, and watching her dab at her mouth with a cloth napkin, always dabbing, touching her lips with it, her teeth, and a redness coming away on the cloth. He looked down into his soup, or stew. Very little was left, a small bit of tail sticking out of a thick, grey broth.
He pushed the bowl away, looked around him. There were other patrons in the small cafe. This shouldn't have surprised him, except that he had seen no one except the motel clerk and his near doppelganger, the golf attendant, since his arrival the night before. There were 6 others, huddled over their food, thickly dressed in layers, high collars, some with weedy mats of hair slapped on top their heads, some with stocking caps, despite the warm day. All looked vaguely ill or hungover, here to recover perhaps from the night before. The fellow closest to Whitcomb had a similar soup bowl in front of him, filled with grey. Periodically he jabbed his fork into the liquid, as if attacking. The walls looked greasy, with large spots by the tables along the perimeter, as if people had rested their heads there, soiling the dingy green paint. He saw a tall man in a muscle shirt asleep at one of those tables, perhaps a sailor given the theme of his tattoos, fish and whales and frogs and waves and some things tendrilled, perhaps vegetation, perhaps not. His torso leaned against the wall, one arm pressed beneath his chest, his head lolling, cheek smeared flat. The sailor suddenly woke up, startled, glared at Whitcomb and pulled his head and arm away from the wall. Sticky, pale threads ran from his flesh to where bits of him still clung to the wall, including part of a bluish anchor design. Whitcomb stumbled out of his chair and went through the door. Had he paid? No one shouted, no one chased him, but he stopped himself out on the beach, thinking that if he hadn't paid, the proprietor would catch up with him and he could apologize, explain that it was a mistake, and pay what he owed, pay double what he owed. But no one came. He looked back down the beach, searching for his motel. He had no idea how far he had come. He also hadn't realized that he'd been walking up a slope, this part of the beach being noticeably higher than from where he'd come. From here, he could see the entire stretch of it, hundreds of yards, and the way the waves came in, taking greedy nibbles. And all that had been ruined, and how the sand moved minutely, but seeing it all together like this, multiplied, so that for the first time he could be sure all that sand, everywhere, was moving. He must have fallen quite hard, because he was suddenly on the ground, eyes and mouth gaping. The sand edged around him. He shut his eyes, trying to force it out. He'd awakened that night, all those years ago, because of a noise, or a dream of a noise. Someone crying. Someone lost. Bits of his memory from that time had wandered off, but this memory at least he had found. His father lay passed out on the bed. Whitcomb was on the rollaway, shivering. He'd always been so skinny as a boy, and easy to chill. As he sat up, he'd realized it was because the motel room door was open, and the ocean breeze was coming in. And the sand. He'd looked around for his mother then, but she was nowhere to be seen. He'd wandered out. His feet must have been damp, because he could remember the sand sticking to them. He remembered looking down, all that clinging sand making his feet look frosted,
sparkling in the moonlight. Out on the beach there was a tall, thin form. He'd recognized his mother's pale yellow gown. She was swaying, and the wind was lifting her gown, and he'd thought he should turn away because he shouldn't be seeing this. She'd turned her head then, and her mouth was so red, and he'd thought she was looking at him. But it quickly became clear she was gazing at the ground behind her, the sandy beach, which was moving. She'd tried to get away from it. She never would have left him if she could have helped it. She'd always been devoted to him, despite her flaws. He didn't know where she was running. He'd only been 8, but even then he'd understood that the ocean wouldn't have helped her. The sand trailed up her gown, began to fall away. He was embarrassed and closed his eyes, but forced them open again as the hazy softness of her went dark. Later his father would hold the empty gown and ask him if he had seen anything, and he would say he had not, because he had not. Whitcomb opened his eyes and saw the drift of tiny particles on the beach in front of him, felt them float in and out of his mouth, in and out of his ears, red bits and soft bits and endless streaming of sand. A lifetime later he sat out in front of his room, taking in the ocean, taking in all the sand. He was missing pieces. He could not remember why he had come here, just that it had been a compulsion, beyond important, but that memory was useless to him now, as were all other memories, scoured and taken and blown away by the wind. But it was almost a relief to see them go. He gazed down at his sweatpants, which were almost empty now. He began to smile, but could feel that even bits of his smile were gone. Between the Pilings by Steve Rasnic Tem. If you'd like to find out more about this author, please visit the featured authors section on our website, nocturnaltransmissions.com.au. Gentle listener, it is so very heartening to see all the new subscribers embracing our humble little podcast. Again, we implore you, do recommend us to your friends. Share the dark flame, even with, in fact, maybe preferably with, people you don't like. Bring some wretchedness and terror into their podcast lives. Speaking of podcast lives, Nocturnal Transmissions will be marking a major milestone in its podcast life when next we meet, as we celebrate our 50th episode. 50 dark tales already, gentle listener. How the time flies when you're having fun. See you in a fortnight. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. Until next time, our 50th time in point of fact. Watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone, especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener. Oh, and one more thing. Thank you, and farewell, Peter Mayhew. May the Force be with you.